So Raefer, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Where are you right now?
I'm currently in Shanghai, so
Oh.
I don't quite have the sexy background you've got.
Yeah, it's a little different. Well, thank you so much for joining. And can you just give a little background on yourself before we jump in?
Sure, with pleasure. I mean, first, thanks for having me. I'm originally Canadian. I am still Canadian. I'm originally an architect and still an architect. Have been living in China for 18, 19 years. Really long story short, just being the busiest place on earth when I graduated and wanting to get my hands dirty. And thrown into the mix here, working on health and sustainability in real estate. Ever since I got here, it's the environment I grew up in, realizing just the scale of the issues, especially out in Asia. And not just that, but the scale and the ability to do something about it. And so I no longer practice, despite still thinking of myself as an architect, but I'm now focused on building standards. We developed the world's first building standard called Reset, that's focused on sensor data. So we evaluate the health of buildings as collected by sensors in real time. And we run the world's largest hub of data on building materials called Origin, where we focus on health and sustainability data, also compiled and updated in real time, universal structure, disseminated out to the world. So that has been a byproduct of just trying to solve issues at scale here, but now luckily enough to have seen that go global.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of a very unique lens to look at some of the issues we've been thinking a lot about. And I'd love to get your perspective on, I guess, to start, when we think about public health, right? We don't usually think of there being responsibility at the asset level, at the real estate level. It's kind of, I think, intuitively thought of as that is a government issue. It's not a private sector issue necessarily. But as buildings and homes are the places where we spend so much time, and there are these endpoints, these kind of nodes of an open society, how do you think this crisis changes how real estate owners need to think about their responsibility for public health?
Ooh, big question. Easy one to start off with. I think honestly, it changes everything. I think people like us have been sort of beating the drum that a lot of real estate owners and operators and the people within them, quite frankly, have been asleep at the wheel for a very long time. And now in proverbial Warren Buffett times, the tide's rolling out, everyone's standing there naked and nobody's fit. So it's looking pretty ugly. So everyone's getting a first look in the mirror at themselves. But the question of responsibility is a fascinating one where, and allow me to, I don't know, give two different perspectives on this, seeing as we have the luxury of sitting in both China and North America where we have offices. And I was in China during the peak of COVID. Then I was in North America as well, reliving the same thing the second time over. So I got to see it emerge in both places, speaking to real estate in both places. And the reaction has been really fundamentally different. And a slight tangent here, I get asked a lot, what can we learn from China? And from that larger philosophical angle, the answer is not much. And the US is gonna have to work a lot harder than people imagine based on this, your question of responsibility. Sorry, it's a bit of a long answer, but the Chinese government has been so effective in coming in so strong at dealing with the issue that a lot of the Chinese real estate is actually not doing necessarily as much as they should be doing.
That's the owners you're talking about specifically.
The owners, exactly. So doing the minimum that's required. because the confidence level in what in how the government has dealt with this, and to their credit, amazingly so, is so high. Whereas in the U.S., where currently there is clearly a lack of leadership, and everyone's on their own, the real estate owners are going to have to work a lot harder to build trust and convince people it's safe to come back in. Whereas in China, it's very much government dictating, okay, from tomorrow, it's safe to go back into buildings. This is how you do it. Off you go. And responsibility very much in many ways taken off of the real estate owners. And whereas in North America, complete opposite. So, you know, the building owners in North America especially need to start seeing themselves as public health officials, because clearly no one else is. And if you want to bring people back into buildings, then the number one concern is going to be communication and building trust around what you know about health and how you're dealing with that in the building. So long answer to the question, I'm sorry, but the notion of responsibility for building owners, how they need to look at their position within building, within public health, is fundamentally changing, and the building owners who are not realizing this are going to be extinct, I believe, after this particular session.
I think that's totally true. And you know, one of the things we were talking about before the call was this issue of like overlapping jurisdictions, right? And you made the comment that there's not a lot to learn from China because the response of government was so far-reaching and had such a kind of command and control nature to it. And in a more open society like North America and the US, we almost have to rely on these kind of tiered layers of jurisdiction, right? There's a federal response, there's a state response, there's a city response, and then below that, you actually have these micro responses, a response at maybe the business park level, at the individual building level, at the individual home level, and then the individual level. And it feels like somewhere in that chain, the notion of responsibility has been so far diluted that people don't think of how they need to embrace it. You know, if I think about this house that I'm in, I'm the mayor of this house, right? I get to make the decisions about who comes, who goes, and the safety of its occupants. And it feels like we need real estate owners to embrace a almost like micro mayoral type responsibility for the occupiers of their building. And that requires communication. And that's something you've talked a lot about. Like, how do you build the right communication between the landlord, the owner of an asset, and the occupants of that asset?
Yeah. Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, sort of crisis response 101, what is the single most important thing in a crisis? Communication. You need to tell people what's going on a lot, need to reassure, give directions, so on. I think this pandemic has showed just how unprepared people have been for communication, especially within those jurisdictions, you know, within their own proverbial house. How do you tell the occupants of that house what to do, or what's going on, rather, what measures are being taken? So communication, absolutely number one. But then number two is, what the heck am I communicating? That's a lot of the issue too. A lot of nonsense and irrelevant things being communicated as well. And this is where we've focused the crux of our attention on data, good quality data that communicates the health of the building in real time, so that there's something to communicate to the tenants, not just on actions you're going to take in the crisis, but actions you've already taken. Sorry.
And I just actually did, to help people understand what kind of data, like, can you just walk people through specifically, what would that data look like that a building owner might collect, draw conclusions from, and then pass along? Like, can you kind of make that a little more concrete?
Yeah. So we collect hordes of data on outdoor pollutants and outdoor environmental conditions, and then mechanical, what happens in the mechanical system of the building, and then how that translates to what happens in the space. So we're looking at particulate matter, PM 2.5. What's fascinating right now, just a little side note, we're launching a new standard in a couple weeks, which focuses on broader spectrum particulate monitoring. So from 0.3 to 25. So these are particles that go straight to the brain and also irritants. So giving occupants a much greater view on what's happening within buildings. Then there's chemical off-gassing from materials and CO2, of course, carbon dioxide. But the two most boring ones that have been the most fascinating ones for me have been temperature and humidity. So we've been talking about the impact of temperature and humidity on the rate of survival of viruses and how much they transmit. Since the 1960s, this is not a new topic. And I was recently correlating and wrote an article on it that the cities around the world that have had the largest outbreak are all precisely in the same temperature and humidity zone. So if you look at all those cities, and New York was entirely predictable. It was going to move into that temperature and humidity zone within certain weeks in end of March and April. And it did exactly that. And now it's slowly moving out of it. So you take that data and you move it indoors, and you can tell a lot about what the risk of virus transmission is and how you're mitigating it, both from a temperature humidity point of view, but also from a particulate matter point of view, because the particulates that come into our lungs, they reduce our immune system and allow us to make us sick. And those are direct correlations. You know, you go online, you can ping me afterwards, I'll bore you with the details, but just showing the direct relation between particle matter, dust, essentially, fine dust, and how it compromises the immune system and how we get sick as a byproduct. Again, this is not new. It's been around since for 2 decades at least.
And just in that example, how much agency would the owner of a building have? So say you were in that sweet spot, right? That zone which maximizes the kind of growth rate of a particular contagion. Could you modify that? Meaning, if I don't know the stats about what percentage of people, and we probably no one knows this at this point, what percentage of people contracted COVID-19 inside an asset, meaning inside a temperature controlled or humidity controlled environment. Are there things that if you had known that, what the optimal and suboptimal settings for the virus growth rate would be, could the building owner change that and therefore reduce the spread of the disease?
Yeah, that's one of my most fascinating, or one of the areas I'm most interested in, is how to take a building and turn it into a safe haven. How do you turn it into a health haven? And it's entirely doable, and it's the way buildings should be run. But it's not rocket science, but it's not. It requires this breaking of barriers. It requires tenant and landlord to be together, to be working together. And when you talk about sort of jurisdiction and who's the mayor of what, and this really comes to light here, because in many cases the tenant is, hey landlord, what can you do for me? And without realizing that, oh, hang on, you've got your own set of responsibilities here. And what we've spent a lot of time within the standard doing is carving out those responsibilities. What's being measured where, who controls what, so that we can help people work better together, right? And I'll give a very concrete example of this. As people see the research and the data that we've got there for humidity and the impact on viruses, which is entirely controllable by the building, the tenants come in and say, hey, I need to lean on my landlord to give me air with higher humidity if I'm in a dry zone. And we say, no, that is the last thing you want to do. No Legionnaire's disease in the ducts, please. Like, we want the air coming out of the central system to be dry. That is not the landlord's responsibility. That is you as the tenant's responsibility. And so all of this is highly controllable. Buildings should be safe havens. It's just a question of knowing who does what and being able to have those both parties have jurisdiction over their own responsibilities.
Yeah, and that communication, it sounds like, between the tenants and the landlords around who is responsible for what. And
then that tenant, yeah, it's key. Communication's key.
And something that interests me is when you think about these jurisdictional issues, right? Like who controls what? What's interesting is to think about the time horizon. So, in my mind, I think about a fire, right? And a fire drill. I've been in many buildings where there are protocols for if the fire alarm goes off, everyone clears out of the building under a certain time frame and you congregate in different areas. And there's something about the immediacy, the imminent threat of a fire and how fast that can have human health and death consequences. And then you kind of slow that time frame down and think about an epidemic where it happens over a slower time frame. But in many ways, the inevitability of a global epidemic was seen by people for decades, certainly years,
yeah.
well before COVID-19. And in many ways, this could be a dress rehearsal, right? This could be a fire drill for something far more virulent, far more deadly that comes along. And then taking that out even further in kind of like the collective action sphere is these problems of collective action that have huge long-term time horizons. And like, I think about the climate crisis as being one of those things, right? So if you're in Miami and carbon emissions stay where they are, you will be underwater at some point. It won't happen tomorrow, it won't happen next week, but it will happen over decades. And how do you think we can change the duration mindset around some of these collective action problems to make owners and tenants think in a more long-term fashion? And is there, kind of as a sub-question to that, I know I'm asking a long one, but as a sub-question to that, is there anything about this experience that you think might help? Right? Is there anything about the learnings and the insights that come from how people have reacted, the success and failures of the COVID-19 response, that might help us better think about how to react to the climate change and who's responsible?
Brendan, you're asking all the easy questions.
I know.
You realize it's still morning for me.
Yeah.
Here. I just gotta...
I'm basically asking dissertation questions, right?
That's right. We don't want to underplay the impact of SARS-CoV-2, but we need to look at the silver linings at the same time. And of course, this is really just climate change and training. And many of us who have been in the field for a long time realize that we actually haven't seen anything yet. Like what we're seeing currently as a crisis is baby steps. It's small, mainly because it's affecting a very small vertical, and that's us humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
A few cats, a few bats, things like this. But there's a lot that we can do to control, such as washing hands and social distancing and hanging out in your house for a while, right? So in terms of a crisis, it's honestly a fairly mild one. It's an infrastructure crisis more than anything. But the silver lining around it is just how much of a wake-up call it is to how completely unprepared we are for crisis management. And as mentioned, starting to realize what this is going to look like. Because we often talk about the new normal, but this is actually, the new normal has been around for a long time. This is the old normal. We're just waking up to it. It's really harsh to say, but we needed something like this. And as an engineer, I studied structural engineering and architecture. Unfortunately, you only make advances in the industry when there's a crisis. When there's an earthquake and people die, structural engineering advances. And so, it's unfortunate, but it's how humans work. We react when there's a crisis. This crisis, I think a lot of people are realizing, is really just helping open up that vision to your earlier point. Say, all right, what happens next? Because I've been in a ton of conferences where people talk about hedging against disruptive threats in real estate, right?
Can you say that
It's
again?
been a bit of a hedging against disruptive threats.
Yeah.
So at conference after conference where you hear this word coming out of building owners, saying, yes, we want to look into ESG metrics, environmental social governance metrics, and to hedge against disruptive threats. And you sit down and go, the heck does that mean to you? And the answer is, I don't really know yet, but it has something to do with climate change, about, you know, being in Miami and underwater at some point in time. But I don't know what it means. Now that we have COVID-19 pandemic, everybody gets a sense of what a disruptive threat is to business, to life, to just emotionals, everything that's going on. So again, long answer maybe to a long question, but we can't break out of it's really hard to break out of our current context unless we have something that stretches our limits, right?
Yeah.
And this is in a way, as devastating as it is, it's so incredibly needed for us as a society to push the limits of what we can imagine, to start thinking in that longer term that you're describing. Start thinking, okay, what we're seeing globally, we're going to see this 3 to 4 times worse situationally, right? And if I'm going to be in that situation, how do I react? What do I need to start thinking about? Because as we said at the beginning, the real estate industry generally has been very much asleep at the wheel. And it's going to be interesting who takes what type of actions around this. And it will be mini jurisdictions. It will be, buildings in many ways are mini kingdoms. And sorry, in my little rant here, in my little monologue, I was actually recently in India, and we've been doing an increasing number of work there. And it finally hit me how India works, because coming from China, where everything's central, and being Canadian, then going to India and seeing the scale of the issue, and you realize, oh my God, how is India going to get itself out of all these issues? And you go there and you realize that it works in these mini quote unquote kingdoms. You have these enormous campuses and these enormous, which have, of course, they're very segregated, but you see some incredible initiatives happening within these mini kingdoms. And it's by far not a perfect model because it is so segregated, but you do see these building owners taking massive responsibility for the health and well-being of their occupants, the water quality, the air quality, so on and so forth. So this idea of stronger jurisdiction within buildings, I was surprised to see how present and strong it was in India. By nature of force, in isolation, not everywhere, of course, but.
And your point is that that's in part because of the scale, right? The footprints of some of these office developments are like cities unto themselves. And so
correct.
In many ways, it pushes the private sector owner of a real estate asset to self-conceptualize as a mayor, right? They are actually responsible. They're the mayor of a mini city.
Yeah, exactly.
And what would you say, just like prescriptively, if you could wave your magic wand and you could influence the CEOs of the world's 200 largest real estate companies, and you could kind of have them do something, what would it be? Like, what would be the thing you would have them do right now?
Wow, another easy question. I mean, I'm biased here, obviously, but I've always been a big proponent of you can't fix what you can't measure, right? Or you can't manage what you can't measure. And without data, it's just another person's opinion. And to cut through the talk, a lot of the building owners just need to become a lot smarter on the health of their buildings. And I don't just mean sort of the sort of viruses and making buildings bioresilient, but also the energy consumption of those buildings.
Yeah.
So, very close to us right now, we're obviously experts in air quality, writing standards for that for over a decade, deploying it around the world. all measured in real time. So it gives us a lot of like pulse on buildings. But now the next gen of that, and what we're actively working on with several building owners, especially now starting in the US, is how do you do that at the lowest possible energy footprint and the lowest carbon footprint, right? Because those are the big challenges for real estate coming up. Is how do I create, by definition, currently a healthier building with all the implications it means for air, means a building that consumes more energy, has a larger carbon footprint. So how do we break that? How do we get to a super healthy building that is also good for the environment, that has a low carbon footprint, low energy? And if I had to wave my magic wand there, it would be having the building owners just focus on really a series of 5 key elements: their air, the energy, the materials that go into buildings, because that affects directly air quality and energy consumed. So that's the critical trifecta: air, energy, materials. And the as it happens, the areas I've spent the past 20 years on. And then communication around that. Because as mentioned earlier, nobody can achieve this alone. It's impossible. So unless building owners start engaging their tenants better via communication, no one's going to get anywhere. So if we want to get somewhere, waving a magic wand, sort of 4 or 5 points for the building owners to focus on. It's like focus on the critical elements: energy, air, materials, communication, in order to build trust. And those are the key pieces.
And if I promise this will be my last out there dissertation like question, but
then we get into the easy ones.
Yeah. In just the last month, obviously Trump and Congress has talked a lot about a major infrastructure plan for the United States, which I think everyone knows we have antiquated infrastructure. Much of the Western world does. And a lot that has become functionally obsolescent. And I'm sure something you've thought a lot about is the interconnectedness of private sector real estate and urban infrastructure. And so one of the things that I think is we're at high risk of doing is building infrastructure that itself becomes functionally obsolescent because we don't contemplate human behavioral changes, right? And I think in response to this crisis, it's almost like a lot of the behavioral changes that were happening at a certain pace, we just push fast forward on them, right? So whether that's migration to suburbs, whether that's re-densification of cities, whether that's the demise of retail, whether that's changes in hospitality, how do you think the government, in designing like 50, 100-year infrastructure projects, how do you think they can collaborate with private sector real estate owners in a way that not only builds the right kind of infrastructure, but builds infrastructure that keeps us safer as a society and has public health in mind? How do you think we could encourage that in the US?
I might be completely out to lunch, and I'm going to take a risk here because it's a newer thought. But I was recently in a tech conference, and somebody asked me, what is the most disruptive tech you see coming out in the next few years? Like, what is the tech that you think has the largest impact? And my answer was insurance. And everyone was, Raefer, you're in the wrong conference. That's the one next door. And the reason for that is, we're sitting on these mountains of data for operations of buildings, right? Healthy operations of buildings. And then these mountains of data for building materials, chemicals that are what are carcinogenic, chemicals of concern that come into our buildings, and wanting to avoid those. And recently we've been pulled into discussions by the 2 largest insurance companies in the world, in China, who are both working on real estate insurance as well as infrastructure insurance for healthy buildings. And it's incredibly simple. You have building material data, you get insured. You don't have it, you don't get insured. You have healthy building operational data, you get insured. You don't have it, you don't get insured, right? And as I was working with these guys, I realized, wow, this is a fascinatingly boring space that I've never looked into, and I really need to look into, because these insurance companies are the only ones who are looking at the short term and the long term. They're
Right.
looking at 1 to 2 year cycles on how it's going to affect your premium right now, and are you going to be dead in 60 years, right? So they're the only ones who are looking at both the short term and the long term.
And also the
And
other interesting thing is they're looking in aggregate, right? I mean, the insurance industry is based on these predictive actuarial models, meaning it might not
yeah,
impact one
good point.
specific
Yes,
asset, but when you're insuring assets globally or when you're insuring assets regionally, you have to think about the macro kind of almost glacial trends that will in fact impact it.
precisely, precisely. And this is what really sort of opened up my mind in working with these insurance companies, because quite frankly, when I walked into these meetings for the first time, like, what am I doing here? And I was thinking, I need to learn more here. I need to learn more about how they're looking at the world, because if we're building infrastructure for 60, 70 years in a government cycle that lasts 2, 4, 8 years,
Yeah.
there's a lot of lessons to learn here on how do you effectively combine the incredibly short term and the long term. So, you know, to me, again, that was the sort of slightly facetious answer to within that conference, saying, yeah, insurance is what's going to disrupt the world. And I don't think I'm out to lunch. I mean, we look at all how insurance companies are reacting to climate change risks, and whether you're on coastal property and so on and so forth. They're looking at those short-term, long-term models. We need to apply those to how we build infrastructure and how we work with the real estate owners to do that.
It's a really interesting point, the concept of insurance, because I think just at a macro level, the cost of insurance rises when there's more existential risk to anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's true of health insurance, it's true of asset insurance, it's true of every kind of insurance. And I think about the impact that capital markets have played for real estate owners in just instigating change around ESG standards, right? Because in particular, environmental standards and decarbonization. And this has been happening for like the last decade, where, you know, large pension plans and large buyers of the public equity of REITs have said, we will preferentially deploy capital. You will have a lower cost of capital as an organization if you have a low or no carbon footprint asset base. And in that sense, you don't need to rely on altruism as much, right? You can actually rely on the behavior of just cost of capital to drive behaviors. And it's a really interesting point, because insurance actually has the longest dated time horizon. It has time horizons that exceed the tenure of any CEO at a real estate company. It has time horizons that exceed the tenure of any politician at a federal or local level. And I had never thought about that, actually, that insurance is in some ways a time adjusted collective action solution, right? Because
Yeah.
we are going to pay for insurance, and it's embedded in the cost of everything. So it's a really unique point of view.
So clearly a little more to learn that there. And I want to riff a little bit off of, you know, you just talked about capital and ESG metrics. And I think that's a really important one to highlight too, because one of the largest influences that I see coming out is insurance, as mentioned. The other one is obviously the one you touched upon. But taking it full circle, where, you know, we're working with a property owner right now that has their financing, a green bond, tied to their ESG metrics, right? And that's great. They launch it, and then they realize, you know what, we're never going to get there, because we have carbon metrics, we have energy metrics, we have waste metrics, we have IEQ, indoor environmental quality, uptime metrics that we need to meet. And we're just not going to get there, because most of that is the tenant's fault. You know, the waste is 99% generated by the tenants. The indoor environmental quality problems are generated by the tenant. The energy is consumed largely by the tenant. And the carbon footprint as a result is the tenant. And so this building owner realizing, unless I figure out how to engage the tenants in working with me on meeting this, I'm never going to get there. And so we're finally seeing this trickle effect of the financial the financial drivers now starting to have a positive impact on finally starting to break the silos between landlord and tenant, starting to work together within these building, to use your term, jurisdictions, right? So a lot of focus on not just tenant engagement apps in terms of I want to sell you more stuff, or please go to the restaurant in the basement and
Right.
here's the next yoga class and all that kind of stuff. But now on, all right, how do I help you help me within the building? And we've had some really fascinating conversations there where we're speaking. Data is always sensitive, and we're speaking to these tenants for which the data we manage, and we're asking, would you be willing to share your data with the building owner in aggregate? And the response universally has been, well, what are you going to do with it? And it's like, well, it's to compile these ESG metrics. And the response universally has been, you know what? I would be interested in sharing the data as long as I get data back, because I need those ESG metrics too, right? So we're starting to see these really interesting two-way dialogues emerge between the landlord and the tenant based on what is essentially ESG driven by financing.
And do you think there can be mechanisms whereby the landlord in leasing space can provide inducements around waste, for example, at the tenant level, right? So today, I mean, most leases are pretty standard in some respect. You're just leasing to occupy space. And what you do in that space is, to a great extent, independent of the landlord. They might bill you for electricity, or they might bill you for certain things, but it'd be interesting to see if you could have a more complex, sophisticated lease that actually embedded the cost of usage, meaning a more environmentally intensive use corresponds to a higher lease rate. And it's almost like the missing link in that is exactly what you're talking about, open data sharing, right? Because the least waste producing tenants would willingly provide that data to landlords. And if the landlords in turn got a benefit on the capital market side or on the insurance side by aggregating and sending that data to those providers, you could create this almost like an implicit carbon tax at the tenant level embedded in the lease, which would be really fascinating. Is that something you've thought about?
It's something we're working on.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's and we were actually in some cases, some of the Asian developers are further ahead. And I was in New York right before the pandemic sort of exploded. Strategically there when it was still cold enough.
When was that?
That was in the end of February,
Okay.
early March. I say that with a grain of salt, obviously. But I was just testing the hypothesis with North American developers, where it's not just the operational metrics, but it's also the building material metrics. So this is another fascinating example where the tenants will choose building materials that have that are end products that consume a lot of energy and are embedded with chemicals that will then contaminate the space next door. So it's not the building owner's fault when when things like that happen, but it becomes the building owner's problem. And we were showing a case study of work we're doing in Asia where the building owner is realizing this and saying, I need to provide an infrastructure of data for my building tenants to help them choose healthier, more efficient materials. And I will collect that data in order to keep making it richer, to give it back to the tenants. So it becomes a bonus of moving into that building owner space because they have all this expertise that goes with it. But this is where we cross the boundaries between just creating tools and quote unquote writing mini legislation, which isn't the form of a lease or a standard, right? So in doing things like this, we need to be looking at the whole piece. So we're in there helping rewrite a clause within the contract, the lease agreement, expanding the tenant requirements that need to be submitted, and then providing the tools to empower this. So you starting this call off sort of on this idea of jurisdiction, I think was definitely the right foot, because we can't just be looking at tools. You have to be looking at the type of mechanisms and understanding the drivers to say, okay, to make this work, to really impact change, I need to be looking at that lease agreement. Not something I'd usually do, but then now I need to be looking at the fit out guides. And you need to touch upon all those quote unquote infrastructure elements to create the type of result that you were just describing.
Yeah.
When then you can start creating incentives and bonuses on actual data, on actual results, using an actual process.
It's interesting to think about how far that kind of that responsibility can get pushed down, right? That kind of like micro mayoral responsibility, that jurisdictional responsibility we were talking about at the beginning. Because I mean, you can envision that obviously at the office park level, like you were talking about in India, at an individual asset level, at a single tenant level, and then even like I live in a community here. And you think about what the HOA does. I mean, HOA basically collects a check from me periodically. But I am guessing that the intensivity of my use versus other homeowners might vary considerably. And I'm not correspondingly taxed, or the cost of my carrying this home is not correspondingly taxed. And it is interesting to think that the key to all of that is data, right? Is data that we need to collect, and how do you provide those incentives around data? Anyway, it's fascinating to reflect on. I think a lot of people think about smart buildings, right? This kind of catchphrase of smart buildings has been thrown around without people oftentimes thinking about what it means and the implications therefrom. But the data is just it's like the bedrock around which you can build an incentive and economic system to drive the behaviors you want. And until we have that data infrastructure, we're really just shooting blind.
Yep. It's just another person's opinion.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we probably meandered through some pretty heady topics, and I'm sure we could go on forever, but this has been incredibly interesting for me, and I'm sure it'll be incredibly interesting for real estate owners and just anyone focused on public health. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with me.
Likewise, Brendan, this has been fun. Thanks for the easy questions.